Welcome back everyone to Build Order Tutorials. This time we have a TvT build order shown to us by Clem on the map Oxide. One of the maps that this build is especially good on. Any map that has a ledge that actually can have the tank on the low ground, shoot the barracks on the high ground is a good map for this. It's also just a fairly good opener if you're struggling with TvT and want something a little bit different. Then, check this out. Try to follow along. Today we have Clem showing us the build, so try to keep up. Let's begin. Send your first SCV out to the front to build your 14 supply depot. Build your 16 barracks. And then a 16 refinery. $17 gas. So this is a factory expand opener, which is also a very safe opener to do. Fill up your first gas as it finishes. And if you want to play safe, you can send an SCV out to scout at this time. Fill up your second refinery. Start up your Reaper and your Orbital. And a depot. Take one out of your gas, one SCV out of your gas, start up your factory, then take two out of the other gas. So you should have two SCVs on one refinery and one SCV on the other refinery. Get another Reaper. Send your SCV to the low ground and build your command center once you have enough minerals. And then start up a HELLION on your finished factory. Add a reactor onto the barracks. Grab a starport and then start filling up your refineries again. A tech lab on the factory. Another depot. From here on, just make sure not to get supply blocked. Start building Marines from the barracks. And a tank from the factory. When you have enough gas, start up the MEDIVAC on the starport. Send an SCV to the low ground to immediately take your third gas now. And get your natural orbital. Continue making depots. Get another tank, and just keep producing tanks from the factory. With your MEDIVAC finished, pick up your Marines and your tank and boost them across the map. You can get another MEDIVAC. That's what Clem does. And your MEDIVAC with the tank inside should be hitting the opponent's side of the map around 4:30. Hopefully you're able to siege up in kind of one of the crannies near the ledge of your opponent's base. In this case, Clem just had an opportunity to take on the main army, so he did so and sieges up in front of the natural, which is also possible. Get a Viking after your second medevac is done. You can rally your units across the map if the build so far is succeeding. And just keep macroing, keep producing from what you have. Depending on how the game is going, you can go ahead and do a double drop into the actual main base at this point, as we see Clem set up to do. Get a tech lab on your starport. Get a Raven when the tech lab is done. And your third CC around this time. If your medevacs are still alive, you can continue to harass with them, which is also giving you a lot of good scouting information. But now we're continuing on into the rest of the build in a macro sense. So grab your fourth gas, get 2 more barracks, swap the barracks and the starport. So the barracks has the tech lab. We're going to start stim as soon as it's ready to go. And you can start producing Vikings from the starport that now has a reactor. And then just play out the rest of the TvT. Remember to get your upgrades and your combat shields and all that good stuff. And let's move on into the build discussion. The strengths. It's a pretty good opener, but it's a very good opener on certain maps, Oxide being one of them. As I mentioned, the better it is to have a tank up near the ledge of your opponent's base where it can shoot supply depots, barracks, and the reactor, the better this build is going to be. But it's not the only thing that it's used for, as we saw Clem actually just siege up at the front of the ramp and then use the medevac for high ground. That's generally the gist of the build. Siege a tank so that it can't be surrounded by SCVs, and then use the medevac for the high ground vision. Otherwise, it's a pretty solid opener to use consistently. It might be difficult, though, for some people who are still grasping the basics of StarCraft and the Terran race. It is something more fun for people who are kind of getting bored with the same old opener and want a little bit more control over the game, which also means they're going to have to both micro and macro. You don't have to be Clem in the video, because, let's be real, none of us are, but you do have to have some execution here. You gotta actually be using your medevac at least a little bit to get that scouting and to apply the pressure. The factory expand opener shown here is a very safe way to open in TvT, so it gives you a warm blanket of comfort. It's not the only way to get into the tank build, but it is probably the safest, especially if you SCV scout. And last, it gives you that control over the TvT, which if you're playing a more typical 1-1-1 Cyclone Raven into tank defensive opener, you can feel like people who are going for maybe like a 2-1-1 opener in the lower leagues, or someone going for this build against you. It makes them feel like they're in control. So it's a good way to change up the pacing of your TvTs if you're getting really stuck on a rut. The weaknesses of the build, it is weak against Banshee play, so it's, you know, if you get your good scouting, if you have your Reaper, if you're kind of suspicious of what they're doing and you use your scans, then every build can be adapted to. That's the beauty of the 1-1-1 setup. But honestly, if you're just trying to execute this as good as possible and you're facing people who have some unorthodox builds, then it could just straight up die to Banshee play. Clem actually lost quite a few games against Bjorn, as Bjorn is one of the few professionals who still uses Banshees kind of on the regular in TvT. But it is weak to it. You don't have a Cyclone, you don't have a Raven, you can scan and use your Marines, but that's never really been a reliable way to do it. And as such, it can be a big problem. Not to mention that the Banshees can be used defensively as well, and you don't really have enough marine power when you're attacking with a single medivac to actually shoot down those banshees. So if you see a banshee, go ahead and just pack it up, go home, and try to defend. It's a tough build to execute correctly because it does require that micro and macro aspect. Again, you don't have to be a micro god, and you don't actually have to get that much with the build. Just try and keep your units moving so that they're not going to die, and that they do at least keep the other Terran on the back foot, as in they're the ones responding to you. So that could mean just dipping in, getting shot by a Viking, and leaving. That still is something that's keeping them more on the back foot, more on guard. It still is very tough. You do want to find something with this, but it's also, I guess, a way for you, if you are getting bored with your TvT build, to actually start experimenting with something more in the early game so you can practice your micro and your macro. But it's a bit tougher, for sure. And, this goes into dealing with the Banshee play, but it does delay the Raven Viking setup that you get in a lot of other TvT openers, and the most common TvT opener, because it is one of the most powerful openers as well. Ravens, very, very good units, not just defensively. You get a couple of Ravens, you move across the map with a couple of Vikings on the way, and you can find your opponent tucked into their little base, totally unable to break free, and suddenly you got a contain on your hands. That happens a lot in TvT. It doesn't necessarily happen with this build. It kind of can, because the tanks still provide some form of contain if they're properly positioned, but because there's so few units with the opener, it's not actually that great. An SCV pool with a concave or whatever your opponent has does better against the tanks and Marines than it would against tanks, Raven auto turrets, and Vikings landing, right? So it's not the best build to do over and over and over again if you're a professional in a best of series, but since most of us aren't, feel free to do it whenever you can. Just keep in mind these weaknesses. Some tips and tricks for the build. On certain maps, the tank can fit right up against the base wall and shoot at depot or barracks, or even factories and starports. If your opponent has not yet learned to keep their production behind the cliff ledges, then that's on them. Take advantage of it. They will lose stim, perhaps. They will lose reactors, perhaps. They certainly will lose at least a supply depot and probably the barracks reactor if they're not totally prepared for this build. It is the gist of the build, so it's unfair to kind of call it a tip, but just maybe to make sure to keep that focus in mind is the tip. You can apply forward pressure like Clem did, so you don't have to feel totally obligated to just finding that little space near the cliff wall and shooting down something in a very calm manner. Especially if you scan ahead or scout ahead in some form and they have like their own tank in position totally ready for it. Then don't do it. You can actually find different ways to play around, either siege up the natural like Clem did, or even pick up everything, keep it picked up in your medivac, and just use the force as a harassment force. Drop it in SCV lines and then try to get away immediately. It's not the best SCV killing drop that's ever existed, but it still is better than nothing. You don't have to go for the second drop. You can move into macro a bit faster. So Clem is actually, I think, one of the guys who does this. So he's actually even a little bit off the usual. You'll see a lot of other people just go ahead, especially if they're being rebuffed. They'll just be like, okay, whatever, not a problem. And they'll just go ahead into the Viking or even right into a tech lab to start building up their own Raven counts. But either way, you're going to want something coming from that starport. And then, of course, you're going to have tanks producing this entire time, so you don't really have to worry about changing that up. The idea of moving into macro faster would be moving into the additional starports, starport units, sorry, faster, and then getting that third CC a bit faster. Try to check if they already have a tank on the high ground. This is the ultimate stop to the build. If it's only a tank on the high ground, you could play, kind of in a fancy way and just drop on top of that single tank and kill it. And then you've already gotten a lot from the drop. But if it's a tank, protected, or a cyclone obviously being microed, then you might want to shy away from actually, again, hitting that specific area that this can do a lot of damage in, and move somewhere else. It's not a super big deal if you can't get the tank sieged up. It's not a super big deal even that you don't do a whole lot of damage with this, so it's better to keep those units alive than try to be bullheaded and force the issue. Keep the Reapers alive to scout ahead, so a lot of talk about scouting right now. Obviously, scans will be available, but the Reapers also did a fabulous job with what Clem showed us there and being able to scout ahead and see what his opponent had. It's also a reason why he just decided to go ahead and drop his units on top of his opponent's force, because it was already fighting his Reapers. If you bring an SCV with the second drop, SCVs can repair the tank and the MEDIVAC. So this is kind of like a very far out tip that honestly no one uses, and no one even really knows or cares about it. But if an SCV is inside a MEDIVAC with a vehicle unit, and the SCV has the auto repair toggle on, so you're gonna have to do this before picking up the SCV will actually repair inside the MEDIVAC. You can check out my tips and tricks video in the playlist and actually see this in action. You'll see a Hellion being repaired from red to orange to green inside a MEDIVAC, but it's kind of a cool thing to do. If you're gonna bring that second MEDIVAC over and continue the pressure, bringing a single SCV to repair either inside the MEDIVAC as you're dropping and loading and harassing, or to just repair a tank that is actually sieged, both still pretty cool. So maybe you don't ever use this, and no one ever does, honestly, but I think it's cool to mention. And if you do it, send me a video of it, and then I'll give you cool ZombieGrub bonus points or something. Yeah. Hope this build helps you guys out. It is certainly a different way to open up with that TvT, as it's a very frustrating matchup, isn't it? But at least this one will give you a little bit more fun before you die a horrible death to a doom drop or something like that. Just kidding. Don't do that. Don't die. But still, it's definitely a more fun way to play TvT. Gives you more control and just something to shake up your Terran life, all right? If you have any specific questions about the video or just very general questions about StarCraft, such as what the hell did I mean by a 16 refinery, then check out my streams on Friday and you can ask all the questions you want. Try to be as patient and calm as possible, even if you ask a question that's already been asked 10 times. So that's on Friday on twitch.tv/ZombieGrub. Otherwise, I hope you all use this build, have fun with the build, and get some MMR points with the build. I'll see you guys next time with more build order tutorials.